Today is Thursday, August 19th. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I am your host, Gilles Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you for tuning in from wherever you happen to be listening. My name is Gilles Taylor, this is No Easy Answers, and I am delighted to have you with us for today's episode. No Easy Answers is a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition. We are 100% listener supported, so if you like what we do and you want to see us grow, the single best way you can help support this podcast is by subscribing to our Patreon. For the price of a cup of coffee, you can help keep this podcast going, and in exchange, you get to hear some of our episodes before anyone else. In fact, listeners received the content from today's episode about a week ago, and they also got to see the video side of today's interview, which, you can unlock if you head to our Patreon page. There's lots more bonus content up on the Patreon right now, and this week I'd like to send a shout out to Adam and Laura and Shelley. They're three of the latest patrons to sign up, so thank you, Adam, thank you, Laura, thank you, Shelley. Your support means the world to us, and we quite simply could not do this without you. So on today's episode, we are continuing on with our crossover series with the hosts of the Asset Horizon podcast, and today we have Will Conway on the show. We are discussing his latest article entitled Thought, Disability, and Refusal. You can find a link to his article in the show notes, and you can find all of his writings at his website, revoltingbodies.com. If you follow the Asset Horizon podcast on Twitter, you will probably know Will by his Twitter handle, Emo Foucault. Will was kind enough to record a reading of his article, and we'll get into that in just a moment. I've taken a few stylistic liberties and added some music underneath Will's reading, and the article comes in at around 20 minutes long, after which Will and I will jump into a discussion about his article, but also about an array of philosophers. And as you can probably tell, this episode will be one of our more philosophy-heavy episodes, and, I'm sure that when you listen to this episode, you're probably, hopefully, going to come away with some questions. And why or how wouldn't you have questions, right? We want to hear those questions. And so we've set up a number of ways for you to send us questions you might have. You can take your pick of any of them. If you want to hit us up on Discord, cool. There's a link for that. Have an episode-specific question, hit us up on our Reddit where we have entries for every episode. You can comment on our YouTube channel or on our Patreon if you're a subscriber. This podcast is pretty active on Twitter, and so, you can just tweet at us. Think about that. If it's 4 a.m. and you're pondering if there's a place for metaphysical idealism in the modern world, you can just tweet that at us, and it will make an alert go off on my phone, and that's okay because I told you to do it. I just want to send a big thank you to Will for his time and, letting us feature his article and for doing a reading and allowing me to take such creative liberties with how I assembled things underneath his reading. Will is just a great conversationalist. I really enjoyed speaking to him, and I think listeners are really going to enjoy this conversation. So let's get to Will's reading of Thought, Disability, and Refusal. And be sure to follow those guys, Will Emo Foucault and Asset Horizon, on Twitter. Check out their podcast. All right, this is Will's reading. Here we go.
Thought, Disability, and Refusal. Section 1. Risks and Boundaries. There is a vital, deeply political, aberrant movement called for indifference and repetition that is, in a sense, a metaphysical revolutionary gambit. It is the destruction of the dogmatic image of thought, which presupposes its own foundational principles. attempting to apprehend thought outside of this doxa, to move away from the objective and subjective presuppositions, and to move outside the modes of recognition, poses a risk. This aberrant movement is one that destabilizes the dogmatic image of thought and leaves in its wake the encounter, the violence from the outside that forces thought. There is a common image of the younger Deleuze, one put forward by Slavoj Žižek and others that, quote, "Not a single one of Deleuze's own texts is in any way directly political. Deleuze in himself is a highly elitist author, indifferent towards politics," end quote. While this idea is rather specious regarding his oeuvre, this explicitly is not the case with difference and repetition once one begins to break down the political implications of the critique of the dogmatic image of thought. The dogmatic image of thought is not just a mechanism by which Deleuze can posit a critique, display some internal validity in the history of philosophy, or just expose a necessary error. Rather, the image of thought possesses an explicitly political function. The moment one assumes the universality of a premise, or worse, that everyone knows a particular presupposition in thought, one has created and circumscribed a constituency of subjects. This constituency is made up of those who reflect, embody, and participate in the goodwill in thinking. But what about those who fall outside of this goodwill? Deleuze opposes the dogmatic image of thought to the image of thought of schizophrenia. The schizo image does not participate in the real to any less extent. Yet under the dogmatic image, it is reduced to error and misadventure. The truth must bear down on this aberrance. The dogmatic image of thought automatically, by resting its foundation upon these subjective presuppositions, pushes bodies and modes of being to the boundary of thought, or the boundary of the anthropos itself. One simple question begins to bring light to exactly how a dogmatic image of thought serves to lend philosophy discursive power. Where do the disabled fit into a dogmatic image of thought? It is not a novel or even controversial assertion to claim that the phenomenological and ontological foundations that ground our understanding of the subject have long cast the disabled body beyond the bounds of these systems. There have been liberalist attempts to rectify these dogmatic images, like Martha Nussbaum's scrambling to find some extension to loop the disabled body into Kant's kingdom of ends, or Rawls' new contract. The disabled remain at this boundary. If, as Deleuze suggests, disability is overwhelmingly viewed as a model for controlled situations of abandonment, the critique of the dogmatic image of thought recenters disability and turns it into a model for revolt. The disabled body becomes a literary war machine that refuses the philosophical language of the unified liberal subject and becomes a mechanism through which we can understand how philosophy itself functions as a dispositif that thwarts the formation of new worlds and new forms of life on the grounds of a metaphysical and epistemological incongruity and incorrigibility. Disability speaks through the figure who refuses to be represented or represent anything. Disability liberation coincides with and effectively highlights the need for a new approach to difference and the images of thought that have proliferated across the canon. The disabled body manifests as both the target and refutation of a dogmatic image of thought that acts as a method of philosophical immunization. Section 2. Normalization and the image. The normalizing power of the image of thought becomes clearer when one can view the image of thought and the philosophical project it's posited by as possessing a certain discursive power. Deleuze, both in his earlier monographs and in his later work with Guattari, provided an articulation of the relationship between the state and the image of thought. There is a striking similarity between Foucault's work on normativity and the formation of apparatuses, and Deleuze's critique of the image of thought. Normalizing power is exercised through processes of identification and intervention. But the apparatuses that enable these processes of subjectivation and interventions into divergent cases necessarily form something else as well. One role among others of these systems is to form an image of society, a social norm. An apparatus is both what establishes a norm, establishes it as an image of any given social order, and directs subjects toward that norm. The dogmatic image of thought doubtlessly sets such a norm, and moralizes it, especially when it must fall back onto a subjective presupposition that everyone knows what rationality means, or that no one can deny the irreproachability of reason. It is through the establishing of this norm that the monster first begins to creep through the shadows of the discourse. Georges Canguilhem describes the monster and the mad as foils for a central norm. In the 19th century, the madman was in the asylum, where he was useful as a foil for reason, and the monster was in the embryologist's jar, where it was useful as a foil for the norm. The individual in the 19th century is always described in terms of his possible or real divergence from something that is no longer defined as the good, perfection, or virtue, but as the normal. The apparatus is what draws the lines of battle across each and every individual subject. Deleuze and Foucault share a resonance in that the state form-inspired image of thought is one that sees obedience as mastery and adherence to reason. One ought to look no further than Foucault's processual theory of the subject. Foucault's shift to ancient Greece towards the end of his lectures at the Collège de France is not a conventional ethical turn, but rather a demonstration that the strength of bourgeois rule has been built even before economic factors on 2 centuries of ethical struggle, of transforming morality, of a generalized dictatorship over behavior and attitudes. The model of civil war is fundamentally maintained in these lectures. It is just extended to the foundations of the ethical itself. Giorgio Agamben, in his genealogical treatment of the term dispositif, explicitly includes the discipline and literature of philosophy as an apparatus. To Agamben, an apparatus is that which has the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. The dogmatic image of thought, which upholds the validity of a particular mode of being and the validity of a particular mode of life, coincides directly with both Agamben's and Foucault's utilization of this term. It also becomes quite clear that it functions as a mechanism of capture and correction if one returns to Deleuze's treatment of Nietzsche. Nietzsche posits a picture of philosophy that cannot be separated from its historical or political milieu. He finds the upright, smiling Prussian citizen sharing a startling number of resonances with Kant's image of thought. Biopolitics and the image of thought, especially as it pertains to the immunopolitics of the sovereign right to life, come to a critical interaction. A terror must be made to reign, a terror of straying too far from the norm. We will have to, once again, return to Peter Singer. An old dogmatic image of thought sits at the root of the bizarre yet terrifyingly institutionally respected utilitarian ethics of Singer, which forge a defense for mass eugenical infanticide. Singer's argument about the ethics of the use of euthanasia for disabled bodies comes down fundamentally to his belief that a human being is defined by its capacity for rational engagements with themselves and their social environment, and to be able to distinguish the two. However, nowhere in Singer's work does he put the rational up to the necessary scrutiny. His method is not, as Deleuze would say, torturous enough. The question of the rational and what it means to think are left beyond reproach, for everyone knows and no one can deny. One wonders whether his Journal of Controversial Ideas could handle the torturous circle Deleuze is looking for in his critique. The dogmatic image of thought is a mechanism of domination because the chasm between thought and practice collapses, One may recall Foucault's statement about the nature of thought itself. As soon as it functions, it offends or reconciles, attracts or repels, breaks, dissociates, unites or reunites. It cannot help but liberate or enslave. Section 3. Refusal. These dogmatic images of thought give rise to, maintain, and justify a molecular domination. There is a figure, though, who manifests among these bodies abandoned to the monstrosity of difference and the phantasmic folly of error. This figure is emblematic of the reality that the front line runs through the middle of each of us, between what makes us a citizen, our predicates, and all the rest. It is in Deleuze's rejection of the dogmatic image of thought and the conceptual persona of the figure of refusal that his anarchic, metaphysically insurrectionary politics shine through. The disabled body and the figure of refusal come to share a common resonance, a solidarity in revolt against dominant images of thought that presuppose unified, obedient, and normalized political subjects. The mechanisms that command thought, that align it with the morally good, are rejected. The figure of refusal explicitly delineates the political, truly anarchic tendency of difference and repetition, as well as how Deleuze's work alters the conventional approach to disability studies and liberation. The act of refusal becomes a means through which subjects, as individual battlegrounds where the struggle for domination takes place, can intervene in the process of subjectivation and begin to counter apparatuses that function to capture. Rejecting the presuppositions of a dominant image of thought necessarily coincides with the rejection of the notion of the subject that the image underwrites. Such a recognition immediately initiates a broader refusal. It becomes the necessary foundation of an open revolt. There is a tendency to read Deleuze as an endlessly affirmative and joyous thinker. Andrew Culp attests that we must correct Deleuze's error, failing to cultivate a hatred for this world. Culp suggests that the effect of the joyous Deleuze's image of thought is a sense of wonder accompanied by the enjoyment of creating concepts that express how the world really exists. This depiction of a joyous, politically unengaged Deleuze may persist somewhere in the academic discourse, but this depiction is a false one. Culp may be presenting an incomplete explanation of Deleuze's alternative image of thought. The effective tones of the senses of wonder and joy that seem to define this joyous Deleuze can only come into existence through a sweeping act of destruction. Just like the child at the end of Zarathustra's 3 Metamorphoses, they are preceded by an act of fundamental rejection and obliteration. This image of a hyper-affirmative Deleuze is no different from Nietzsche's braying ass that does not know how to say no. Culp's Dark Deleuze is a great text that serves as a necessary correction for some of the tendencies in Deleuzean scholarship, but it may not be a correction of Deleuze himself. The shadowy figure of refusal proves Deleuze's work to be plenty dark and conspiratorial in itself. The figure of refusal surely possesses a hatred for this world. This individual full of ill will, who neither allows himself to be represented nor wishes to represent anything, is the final hindrance and merciless destroyer of the dogmatic image of thought. This act of refusal initiates the process by which an individual can intervene in their own subjectivation. But the moment of refusal is rare and difficult. It is difficult because one must refuse not only the worst, but also what seems reasonable. The figure of refusal is, in a sense, not immediately intelligible. This refusal, which culminates in a revolt, is a rejection of representation. It is to proclaim that one does not possess this goodwill, that one does not think this way, and that one refuses to be represented as a subject. The individual who rebels is finally inexplicable. If this figure of refusal is to simply be reduced to error by a dogmatic image of thought, then they are an incorrigible error. They refuse to be hidden or eliminated. They are comparable to the error that has become animated in Kierkegaard's Sickness unto Death. One that says, no, I will not be erased. I will stand as witness against thee, a witness that thou art a very poor writer. The figure who refuses representation stands as a witness to the insufficiency of the dogmatic image of thought. If the overwhelming model for disability is a controlled situation of abandonment, the refusal of the dogmatic image of thought turns that position into the revolutionary one. Remember, the war machines always make contact with or come from the outside. The state form inspired an image of thought, but the state has no war machine of its own. The disabled body is certainly often confined, rejected, and abandoned. Tobin Sievers may have been correct to attest boldly that the disabled belong to the nation of the abandoned and the dead. This is a pessimistic outlook, but it is this pessimism that must be organized, rather than those with malformed extensionist optimism. It is only through this refusal of the image of thought, this rejection full of ill will, that new images of thought become possible, images that are no longer functioning as the tribunals of an under-examined yet all too powerful reason. The abandoned carry with them the wounds of the failure of the present. However, they possess the insurrectionary threat of a different future. The coming people will be made from today's enfants perdus. This act of refusal recognizes one crucial thing. It recognizes that politics precedes being. The dogmatic image of thought becomes revealed as a governmental machine that is no different from any other apparatus of capture. It is this recognition that allows for the intervention in the processes of subjectivation to begin. The destruction of the dogmatic image of thought opens up the possibility for new forms of life. That is always the role of emancipatory disability theory. Deleuze's open and wondrous image of thought can only be realized in the wake of the destruction of the dogmatic image of thought. Section 4. Opposing the present. Deleuze's critique of the dogmatic image of thought exposes the normalizing power of philosophy as an apparatus. The dogmatic image of thought shows the biopolitical role philosophy plays. It impedes the materialization of new forms of life by reducing them to error, to the mutilation and misadventure of a once pure thought. This is an explicitly biopolitical function. For biopolitics has never had any other aim but to thwart the formation of worlds, techniques, shared dramatizations, magic in which the crisis of presence might be overcome, might become a center of energy, a war machine. Disability comes from the outside, with hands that converse, eyes that listen, and skin that sees. It is not just a rejection of the violent ableist framework. In obliterating the old images, new assemblages of sensation can break through. Crip theory must always philosophize with a hammer, but it must also always move towards new forms of life. It must move towards a radical yes-saying. It allows for the exploration of new modes of being, new phenomenological orientations, and new political ontologies. To achieve this, disability must remain militant in its opposition. Those who attempt to articulate disability literarily must never serve to justify traditional ways of thinking. Disability rejects the dogmatic image of thought as insufficient and refuses to represent it or be represented by it. The rejection is what allows for the Deleuzean affirmation to burst through. But the use of philosophy is to sadden. A philosophy that saddens no one, that annoys no one, is not a philosophy. A philosophy that does not sadden and does not annoy only serves the present.
All right, so this podcast is a very Marxist podcast. If there's one thing I've kind of learned about myself, even, is that like the lens by which I analyze things is really like decidedly Marxist, like much more so than a lot of other friends that I know, theory people too, you know. And so in terms of reading Deleuze, like there's a real joy that I get from Deleuze and Guattari with the AntiOedipus stuff and A Thousand Plateaus and DNR and you know, stuff like postscripts on the control societies, like all really wonderful stuff. But part of what I have struggled with this very heavy-handed Marxist lens is succinctly sort of delineating how their texts are, one, revolutionary, two, like encouraging of like the accelerationist aspect, like how you get from point A to point B with that. So I think your article really shored up a lot of those concepts in my head as far as like where these things are acutely demonstrated within the text.
Yeah, like the part of what has always frustrated me about, because there's a clear difference, right, between pre-68 Deleuze and like post-meeting Guattari Deleuze, right, where there are engagements with Marx, especially in Difference and Repetition, but they're not the same as they are in A Thousand Plateaus or AntiOedipus. The political intensity is much more veiled, but it's entirely present, I think, in Difference and Repetition, explicitly in the dogmatic image of thought. And if one is to sort of understand Deleuze at the level of like the phenomenal and the epistemological, the phenomenological and the epistemological, it is to understand that this is a man who saw like Hume's epistemology as like one fundamentally based in the individual as political, and that habit as a political process. So Deleuze is already starting in texts like Instincts and Institutions, Empiricism and Subjectivity, from the standpoint of the political. But the problem is, I think a lot of American work on Deleuze tends to favor trying to reach a sort of importantly metaphysical, but politically sort of zapped, for lack of a better word, a politically weakened reading of Deleuze. And I think one way to sort of do that, and I don't mean to engage in like polemics, but like Paul Patton translated Difference and Repetition, and Paul Patton's work on Deleuze's politics is essentially to assert that Deleuze is sort of a cosmopolitan market liberal, like a meta-liberal in a sense. So there is, at least in certain parts of the academic sphere, people who engage with early Deleuze as being sort of apolitical. Slavoj Žižek, for example, in his book Organs Without Bodies, which is an attempt at a Lacanian critique of Deleuze and Deleuze and Guattari, says that Deleuze's early works are great precisely because they're not political. And I don't think that could be further from the truth. I think part of the problem with when we assert like what is and is not political, I think we fail to understand the metaphysics, but most importantly, the ontology that underwrites our politics, and then the politics that underwrites that ontology, right? Like what allowed for this to be the way in which the subject manifests, the way in which the rational individual in the political sphere manifests. What does it mean? What does it mean to think? What does it mean to be rational? What is an adequate image of thought? And all of these are largely political questions. They have immediate political consequences, especially with when we look at the ways in which Kant was dealt with in American academia in the 60s and 70s, right? We have figures like John Rawls attempting to say, no, wait, actually, like Kant's cosmopolitanism and his ethics, like I can fix this. I can come in with like a liberalist extension to allow for all these other things. And then you have Martha Nussbaum, who writes about the about species membership and Kant and Rawls, and attempting to save Rawls from a critique of it, because they realize that like there's a realization that the metaphysics that underwrite and the theory of the subject that underwrites all of these political assumptions is one with really tangible and very violent problems. And I think it's figures like Deleuze who, in the history of philosophy, can help us identify that stuff. You have to invest in it politically in order to see the political. If you don't invest in these texts politically, then you can come out with an apolitical text because you went in for an apolitical one. You could come out with an apolitical reading of AntiOedipus, I imagine.
Right.
If you want to talk about the three syntheses and leave nothing else on the table in your discussion. There are certainly a lot of Deleuzians who do that too.
Yeah, I've been like, for instance, like Nietzsche, there's a podcast I'm listening to on critical theory where one of the guys asserted that Nietzsche was like an apolitical writer. And obviously there's some passages with like Nietzsche where he just speaks about kind of being apolitical and doesn't care about politics and stuff. But then there's this notion that like Nietzsche was an advocate for better culture, and insofar as this project took into account society and its mechanistic aspects in an attempt to advocate for a higher order of culture, that in itself is through and through political. So like as far as, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. When you engage with these writers, if you're not looking to get something political out of them, you could maybe walk away from something like AntiOedipus without a acutely political reading. But yeah, I just think that your article really hammered home some of the ways that, like, if you had asked me before reading your article, like, in what way was Deleuze political? I'm not so sure that I could have codified a sufficient answer to that. But I know that you have these interviews, at times, and people ask you about like why Foucault, and I get the feeling that like that's kind of an exhausted question for you. You're kind of the Foucault guy at this point. Can you just give us some backstory as to like how you were introduced to Foucault and why it appealed to you?
I was introduced to Foucault essentially in college because I did debate, and Foucault was thrown around quite often, and he was always the stumbling block for me in a debate round. I could never quite get a grasp on what was happening in round when there was a Foucault card. So like you cut cards in debate, you run positions. So if Foucault was, let's say, the topic of discussion, I would flounder. So I committed one summer to just reading a bunch of Foucault out of frustration. I wanted to stay purely in my sort of soft left debate space where I could just not have to engage with this kind of theory extensively. So I was reading I was reading a lot of other like philosophical work at the time. Like I remember David Hume was an interest of mine briefly. Oof.
Right.
But so I finally sat down and I read Madness and Civilization, and I was absolutely floored. Which then, of course, would lead to me wanting to read Nietzsche. So basically, the reason that I do philosophy is because I stumbled upon Foucault. Foucault is what sits at the origin of my philosophical interest in a sort of serious, studious way. But beyond that, it wouldn't be until later that my engagement with Foucault would actually mean something to me. Because as I worked through the intro to philosophy, the undergrad level philosophy courses that universities can offer when they don't have a philosophy program, none of it really spoke to the experiences that I thought Foucault did. There wasn't an extensive engagement with figures like Marx beyond the manifesto and maybe like the first 80 pages of Capital, which I also think is the most frustrating way to start Marx. I think if you jump straight into to the commodity with Marx, you're actually going to be in a really, really strange spot with him. There needs to be a lot of other work done around him. Maybe that's the Althusserian position. I'm going to get criticized on Twitter or whatever for saying this, but I stand by. For me, Foucault spoke to what I thought were, and maybe this is a hackneyed term, but I mean it with like a sincerity, underrepresented figures in both the history of thought and the history of governance and medicine. And Foucault is essentially what allowed me to see like my disability in a different way. It allowed me to understand disability at the level of like the political universal, that notion of abnormality in a different way. So for me, why Foucault is precisely because there was an intensity in his work that I hadn't found anywhere else. That there was a strain that was present in his work about uncovering these voices of resistance, these problems, these breaks, these individuals in revolt, right, that present a direct confrontation to these overwhelming, often hegemonic discourses that I think I hadn't seen anyone else bring to the floor. And in many ways, I still don't think that there are many folks who have pulled off that methodology. There are plenty of people who have tried, but I think the methodology that Foucault uses and changes throughout his career through the 60s, and finally the genealogical shift in the early 70s, like the methodology Foucault utilizes is a really, really hard one to actually replicate. So I think in many ways it allows you to have an interest in philosophy insofar as you are interested in relations of power and the subject and its relation to power. So for that reason, I think that's my sort of jumbled answer to why Foucault.
Well, the thing about Foucault is that, obviously he has this like kind of unique methodology employing history and a sort of like archaeological excavation in order to shine light on power relations. And so, one of the questions that I ask folks on this podcast, if there's a space for it most of the time, is like how they feel about the reconciliation of like the projects of Marx and Foucault. When I had Todd May on the show, he had spoke about how the projects of Foucault and the projects of Marx, even though Marx, like Marxists would be a little upset with Foucault and that like he maybe took power and diffused it to the point where it's really abstracted and there's not like a principal point of intensity within that, the Marxist school of thought with the bourgeoisie controlling the power, and that's the focus of attack. But Todd May was like, both of these projects can coexist, and he basically told me to go read Rancière. He was like, these can exist at the level of the fundamental animating, action of both of these is like egalitarianism. And then I had, when I asked Gabriel Rockhill about this, he had some like scorched earth stuff to say.
Yeah, I heard.
Oh, cool. And for listeners who haven't caught up on that episode, Gabriel was very upset that the CIA had pinpointed the work of Michel Foucault in order to drive an ideological wedge between Marxists and left anti-communists and left communists. So I just want to get your take on what you think is ultimately what's your take on the reconciliation of both their projects.
Okay, so for some things like I want to start with. I actually don't think Foucault abstracts power. I actually think it's like very practical and quite material in the sense that like even when Foucault turns to ethics, it's a discussion about how like the battle over the production of subjectivities and the acts of subjectivation has been the result of like a direct battle for bourgeois rule over these things. Like what does it mean to be an ethical subject in Athens, right? Even before we have these discussions about primitive accumulation, there are already these lines of conflict present. So in a sense, like when we talk about, let's say, normalizing power, right? We take for granted, I think, sometimes what normativity means, because in like the 19th century, like the normal manifests in medical literature to sort of contra to the monster, to monstrosity. But normalizing power manifests essentially in replacing like the conventional moralities of plebeian pre-industrialization society to ensure that you have an adequate workforce, that there can be not only an accumulation of capital, but an accumulation of bodies that can function adequately within these working spaces. So not only do I think that like there is an element of Marx and Foucault that is compatible, I think that for some Foucauldians who can't see the validity of the Marxist critique, I think they have a problem with their own reading of Foucault. And then on the other end, I think that if there are Marxists who believe that Foucault is entirely incompatible with Marxism, I'm going to urge them to actually just return to Capital. I think that the reality is, if you look at texts like, and I talk about this all the time, if you look at sections of Capital Volume 1, like On the Working Day, and the investment in the management of the lifestyle and timing and habitual practices of the proletariat. When you look at how the factory breaks down particular motor skills of workers in chapters like large-scale industry and cooperation in large-scale industry, what you can see is the beginning of what would end up being like one of the most deployed terms in the 90s, which was the concept of the docile body in Foucault. But Foucault's docile body is essentially the result of his engagement with the work of Francois Guéry and Deleuze, who produced a book in 1972, I think just before AntiOedipus, called The Productive Body, which was on the phenomenological experience of the body under capital, and also the status of the body in Marx's Capital, and how there is a sort of another production of the body that can produce. Right. So there's a deeply Marxist strain in many of Foucault's works. Even in Madness and Civilization, Foucault would maintain throughout his career that there are even Marxist elements in that text. And Foucault would always sort of joke that, like, if Marxists can only see the Marxist element if I like name check Marx, then I don't think they're that good Marxists. Like, if they can't identify Marxism adequately in a philosophical text or a Marxist intensity or strain of thought, but so that's the reconciliation issue. I think that the two can be used together, because I think they each provide a lot of Foucault's work isn't possible without Marx. So that's what I've never understood about, and this was always a lot of what Foucault would say in interviews would be like, any historian coming after Marx has to have some sort of engagement with that position about accumulation, about the function of industry, and that essentially there hadn't been an account. Like the physiocrats have sort of an underrepresented position now in the history of economic theory. There's a car going off.
It's cool, man. My place sounds like a construction zone sometimes. There was a dog barking out there earlier.
Is that getting picked up?
Yeah, probably. It's fine though. You know, listeners will understand. It'll be okay. There are these other figures in the history of articulating sort of the capitalist turn in the 18th and 19th century that might get overlooked if we just say that it is Marx. But the reality is there wasn't an engagement with or an articulation of capital like that. And there frankly hasn't been one since. There have been people who have tried, like Thomas Piketty tries to present sort of a new age, more
kind of neoliberal presentation of the accumulation of capital and sort of post-industrial, I guess you could say class struggle, but he doesn't really come down to that. And honestly, Piketty's a liberal.
Right.
But
right.
So the reality here is that I think these two figures are compatible if you want them to be. You just have to be able to read Marxist theory without having to be spoon-fed where the Marx is. Like, can you imagine if you had to read like Marcuse, but like didn't understand it because you needed to be able to parse out where exactly Marcuse was being Freudian and where exactly he was being Marxist?
Right. How ridiculous. Yeah. Go on. It's someone else there, right?
And then the next being the Gabriel Rockhill thing about Foucault being seen as a possibility for like disrupting like Marxist organizing. The CIA also saw the function of postmodern art, like Rothko and Calder. So like if Andy Warhol and a historian took down like the USSR and all of these like massive opera, then like, to be honest, I don't know how much longer they would have survived in the face of like, post-industrial, post-World War II U.S. power. Like,
sure.
Maybe the CIA saw value in the fact that like Foucault did present Marxist infighting, but my position would be that like most intellectuals in France at the time produced Marxist infighting, right? So whether it be Herbert Marcuse being accused of maintaining his position as like a CIA asset even after he left the OSS, we have the famous sequence of events where Theodor Adorno is sort of seen as an enemy of the revolution. Students show their bare breasts to him, right, in a sort of spectacular refutation of him. People are holding signs that say, he must be destroyed in order for Sartre's considered a bourgeois enemy of the revolution to the point where like he has to explicitly point out that interaction with Marxists in Existentialism as a Humanism. Louis Althusser ends up being cast aside by the French Communist Party. So it seems to be just a standard operating procedure if you are a French intellectual to eventually be despised by the French communists, and right. Therefore to be hated by subsequent Marxists. And look, are there issues where I can understand a frustration if your commitment is always going to come down to a particular understanding of contradiction that exists in Marx when you read figures like Deleuze and Foucault? Yes, right? That sort of post-Hegelian framework may not always be entire, especially when it comes down to power and the productivity of power, may not always be compatible. And a good theorist like Jacques Bidet, to some extent Antonio Negri, and even frankly folks like Tikkun have to work out where they find themselves in the face of these various attempts to articulate the history and problems of the present. I've never understood this idea of people who become completely. I understand people who become theory partisans, who find figures and folks that speak to them and will always defend them. I've never understood folks who always seek out enemies in the history of philosophy. Because the reality is those enemies usually manifest pretty clearly. Like Habermas doesn't hide the fact that he's a proponent of like the contemporary liberal world order, right? Francis Fukuyama openly took a job with the second Bush administration, right? So
right.
These individuals are not exactly, subversive actors. They're usually quite open about their politics. So I find it fascinating that like these individuals are problematized that are attempting to articulate something. And maybe you disagree. Maybe that's not compelling to you, and that's totally fine. But I think to say that this is the individual that stands between me and the revolution, like the guy who holds, Jean Hippolyte's chair at the Collège de France in 1971 is the guy preventing your revolution, I think is rather silly. And yeah, I think there was one more question, but I can't.
Oh no. Well, I just think that so like there are these questions of like no matter what you're trying to do, like if you I guess the way that I spoke to Todd is that like in addition to questions of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and the political and all these things, right? There are all these still like these perennial questions that one has to ask that maybe aren't like covered entirely by political economy, right? So you have to ask yourself like, who are you? What does it mean to think? How do you make your way in the world? What is meaningfulness? All these like questions that
That's
like
absolutely
undergird,
right.
like, and so like as far as Foucault's project, I feel like they have pertinence outside the realm of the political, because as you go about your life trying to answer these sort of perennial questions of who am I, who are we, what's important to me, how do I lead my life, what is my moral code, all of these things, right? You quickly encounter sort of stratified power within society that imposes limitations on the human subject and its capability, its potential, and the possibilities within your own existence. So, in my mind, the projects of Marx and Foucault, I don't really think much about their compatibility as much as I think of Foucault's usefulness in terms of like just getting you to understand that as you go about your life and create, other people are creating around you, and you have to take all of these things into consideration as you navigate an increasingly complex world. So that's where I kind of come from that. But being the heavy-handed Marxist that I feel like I am with my analysis, right? I look at Foucault and lately I've had a real like I guess a re-engagement. I've commenced a sort of re-engagement with Nietzsche, and I've come out the other side with like not feeling so great about Friedrich at this point, man. Because there is this there's a book by it's called Nietzsche's Corpse, and corpse is spelled C-O-R-P and with a forward slash. It's C-O-R-P. I'm spelling corpse and then like a slash right before the E, so it's like a corp is in like a group of people versus like the corpse.
Yeah, Nietzsche's core,
and then corpse or whatever, right? Yeah. So that book kind of what the author kind of posits is that Nietzscheanism is the only position outside of communism. Which is kind of a wild concept, and the more that I thought about it, the more it was like, okay, well, I could see how the Domenico Lacerdo book saying that that Nietzsche is like an aristocratic rebel, that he's advocating for a sort of aristocratic rebellion or revolt of the aristocracy, basically, like the undoing of the French Revolution, sort of. You could label Nietzsche as like broadly like an anti-enlightenment thinker, and that like he is fundamentally anti-egalitarian. All that being said, when I look at some of the things Foucault said about Nietzsche and that his Marxism is more of a Nietzschean Marxism, I had to sit with that for a second and really try to understand that. And I wonder if you would agree with me in that. I think that what Foucault was getting at when he said his Marxism was more of a Nietzschean Marxism, I think that he was, alluding to the way that post-structuralists criticize structuralism with their use of like history, the use of genealogies. I don't think he was speaking about a Nietzschean Marxism in terms of any other aspect of Nietzsche, like the Overman or a revolt of the aristocracy, or because I've been trying to figure out what exactly he meant by that.
So this is also like something that I've been working on is like trying to figure out exactly where Foucault's relationship to Nietzsche is beyond methodology. I think what you're talking about though is precisely that. I think like what you have found is, and this is what I think a lot of people don't seem to see in Foucault sometimes, and it can be a little frustrating, is that like Foucault no doubt takes at least some level of ontological work from Nietzsche just at the level of power, but it's kind of superficial at that level. Foucault is engaging with Nietzsche much more with the way like the second essay of the genealogy of morality is structured, rather than saying that there is going to be a figure who recognizes the cosmological truth of the eternal return and therefore passes over themselves to become the Ubermensch who will not, like, not necessarily. In fact, Foucault would laugh in an interview where he would say, I'm much more a Nietzschean of the birth of tragedy and the genealogy than a Nietzschean of Zarathustra.
Right.
Like, there are absolutely sympathies that Foucault has with Nietzsche, particularly when it comes to like the state and the belief that the state is sort of this natural manifestation of the progression of humanity, and that it's not the product of a contingency, but in fact, like a manifestation that speaks for the essence of the human being in a sort of Feuerbachian kind of way. There, you can draw sort of comparisons between, like, can the state speak for people? Both Nietzsche and Foucault probably say no, right? But beyond that, I think sometimes you have to be really, really careful with how you read Nietzsche. And instead, when you're working with Foucault and Nietzsche, try to find places of compatibility at the level of methodology and the way in which both Foucault and Nietzsche see the production of particular subjectivities, but even that seems are like anachronistic to Nietzsche. So what I'll try to say here is that, like, Foucault understands that it's kind of funny to say to call oneself a Nietzschean Marxist. In Remarks on Marx, he says that, like, part of what forced him not only the Doctor's Plot, but what made it easier after the Doctor's Plot to basically leave the Communist Party was his engagement with Nietzsche, and the fact that you were seeing no scholarship surrounding Nietzsche from faculty who were deeply engaged with the Communist Party, and for reasons that at the time would seem reasonable, because obviously Nietzsche was considered to be, in a certain sense, aligned ideologically with a particular kind of notion of power and personal, and the assertion of personal strength that read kind of fascistically, and that's even kind of sometimes palpable in even Walter Kaufmann's work when he talks about hierarchy. But the question would be, when we talk about egalitarianism, are we talking about sort of the massification of behaviors, thoughts, activities, modes of being? Are we establishing sort of a uniform norm upon which we are going to conduct ourselves? Is that what egalitarian means? And Nietzsche seems to see that sometimes that's what these notions of equality mean. That like, for example, on that which makes one small, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he spends a lot of time talking about architecture, right? People moving from house to house to house. In a certain sense, one could come up with a sort of Nietzschean Marxist critique of that, right? One moves from their small apartment to their factory, to their bar, to their school, back to the factory, back home. Like, there are these elements of Nietzsche where you can draw pretty direct lines between him and Foucault. There was a book that was recently published this year. I haven't read it. About how the last man takes LSD, and it's about Foucault and the foreclosure of the notion of revolution, and it tries to show that Foucault is like an enemy of like broader revolution and all of this. Like they sort of provide an interpretation of Foucault that shows that he's more compatible with sort of neoliberal politics of the self and so on. From the face of it, I don't think it's true. I haven't read it, but I have a lot of issues with Zamora's other work on Foucault, so I'd imagine I'm not going to love this one.
Right.
But what I find about The Last Man is the man who willingly submits himself to the asylum upon no longer believing that he is actually equal to the other. And I think that that self-internment is extraordinarily important. That the last man is that which willingly submits oneself to the asylum. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is a text that cannot be overanalyzed. Every single word is really important to Nietzsche. Every single subsequent text that Nietzsche writes after Zarathustra seems to be aimed at getting you to read it, right? Like the end of the second genealogy of Morals, he's like, enough, just go read Zarathustra. He can deliver this message of eternal recurrence because I'm too ill of the modern world to do it myself. So I have to invent this character, Zarathustra, who can then deliver it, right?
Right.
So Zarathustra is really important. So when we talk about how the figure of the last man is one who, takes a little entertainment in the evening, a little bit of poison to go to sleep. This is some pretty contemporary, like this is some pretty standard critiques of the modern world. So I do wonder whether or not a Nietzscheanism when it comes to the politics of communism. I think you would have to determine what your Nietzscheanism means, right? Because there's like 15 different ways one can walk away from Nietzsche. One can walk away with, like Deleuze does, a metaphysics of competing forces, right? The metaphysics of the phantasm, inspired heavily by figures like Klosowski and Asafal's reading of Nietzsche. You can walk away with Nietzsche as a sort of limited anthropological pseudo-historian with a genealogical methodology that shows how the convergence of different events allows for the discursive manifestations of reworked notions of debt, right? And in a certain sense, Deleuze acquires that later in his career with the third chapter of AntiOedipus, but also, of course, that's where Foucault pops up, right? Foucault's methodology allows for what are the conditions of possibility to allow for these new formulations, these new relations of power to manifest. And then, of course, there are all of these other like terrible interpretations of Nietzsche where it's like figures like the Bronze Age pervert saying that Nietzsche just wants you to be really tough and like, wants you to eat a lot of raw beef or whatever it is that these people are up to.
Right. I was thinking the other day about how, going back to Foucault's Nietzschean version of Marxism, and that he uses like kind of like a genealogy of morals, not like a Zarathustra Nietzschean, but like a genealogy of morals thing. I think that whether the left understands the origins of this sort of approach to a critique or not, I think there are some very contemporary examples of authors on the left using a sort of historical archaeological excavation thing in order to shine light on power relations. Like look at fucking like Alex Vitale, going through the history of police in order to show you that police are not just this thing that are like already always having been there, as they appear to people in society, right? You look at someone like Vicky Osterweil with her In Defense of Looting. And that text to me is like, that's kind of an insurrectionary text in the way that, like, Vicky she's not a historian, and she's an everyday person that wrote about history in a way to shine light on power relations. So I think what you're getting at is really cool. And I want to like kind of segue into asking you about your article now.
Okay.
Because we spent quite a bit of time talking about Foucault and Nietzsche and all that stuff, which is all.
Oh, you can always just chop it up, right?
No, man. I want to keep this entire thing in there, man. We could chop it up, but so I want to ask you like what your headspace was when you arranged this article, when you wrote it. Like, I just want to get a sense of your headspace on like what inspired you to write it.
Yeah. So like you, I was excited to jump back into Deleuze when I read Difference in Repetition, because the last time I'd read anything by Deleuze, it was Proust and Signs, a couple chapters from Proust and Signs. It had been a few months. since I'd even thought about Gilles Deleuze. Like, we always think about Gilles Deleuze over at Acid Horizon. Like, every few months there'll be another episode. So I'm sure I read an essay here or there, or a chapter out of Logic of Sense or something. Because Craig is always great at ensuring that we always keep those roots and commitments to Deleuze alive, and Foucault. Our first episode was that conversation between Deleuze and Foucault, Intellectuals and Power.
Y'all just had a recent, was it like Concepts in Focus, didn't you?
Yeah. So
cool.
So I was reading Difference of Repetition, and like you, I was kind of struggling so I was like, okay, so like the metaphysics of representation lead to all of these problems where we constantly revert back to the concept, the notion of the idea and the same, right? Even with attempts at articulating difference that we see in Aristotle, Duns Scotus, Kant, Leibniz, and so on. And the problems either exist at the level of the predicate and so on. And I found it fascinating in a very limited sense. I was struggling because my engagement with philosophy is limited to what can I steal from this thing, run away with it, and then sort of try to work in the realm of the political. And so, like you, I was struggling to find something to hang my hat on, to give this thing immediate material stakes. And it was actually Craig, who ran a small reading group of Difference and Repetition, who read a small piece on the concept of refusing, because he was reading Blanchot at the time. So he started a discussion on the image of thought by saying, and there was this figure of refusal. So he said, okay, what does it mean to refuse something? And it was from there that I was like, okay, hold on. Like, this figure of refusal, like, is what absolutely grounds like the destructive capacity of Deleuze. Like, all of these individuals who constantly assert that like Deleuze needs to be prodded and pushed in this particular direction because he's too affirmational, right? We have figures like Andrew Culp, who wrote a great book, Dark Deleuze, who says that there are readings of Deleuze by folks who leave him in the realm of the affirmational, always in the process of affirming what actually exists. And what we need to do is we need to have Deleuze cultivate a hatred for this world. But what we see is that Deleuze's image of thought that is sort of wondrous, open, and free, right? This sort of reworked Humean understanding of experience and the categorization of those experiences. It's only possible once we have this figure of refusal who can absolutely reject the dogmatic image of thought, which is essentially that which presupposes that everyone knows this or that element of the philosophical system, right? So we get individuals like Descartes who are critiqued by Hegel and others for not thoroughly doing away with objective presuppositions, right? And Descartes certainly thought that he was, right? By not presupposing the concept of the rational human, he can therefore move forward. But obviously Hegel and then eventually Deleuze in the image of thought are going to say, well, actually, there's this deeper problem here where once we sort of have a subjective presupposition, which it seems to be at least a little bit more pernicious insofar as it's a pre-philosophical notion that exists in a given philosophical framework, right? Once we have sort of that lines and underwrites our entire metaphysics, essentially, but most importantly, what it means to be like a perceptive subject or a subject that just has the capacity for experience, then there are not only like in the sense of like Kant, where we have illegitimate and legitimate uses, but quite quickly we start to see sort of legitimate and illegitimate images of thought themselves. And Deleuze, I think, in a sort of almost serendipitous manner and very prescient, opposes the image of thought of the schizophrenic to the image of thought that one sees in Kant. And if that doesn't immediately get you to start to see that there are elements of difference and repetition that are going to ground some of his work with Felix Guattari, then I think you might be suffering from a depoliticized reading of Deleuze. So when Craig talked about this figure of refusal, I was like, okay, where can I go with this? Because I remember reading parts of the Image of Thought chapter for a course I was taking a couple weeks prior to that, and I was thinking, this is a really, really, really fascinating text to read from the perspective of disability, because once a subjective presupposition is accepted as true, it starts to immediately circumscribe who has legitimate claim to the real, right? And once we're at that level of ontological stake, then we're in a pretty contentious and conflicting zone. So the figure of the schizophrenic in Deleuze's text, the schizophrenic image of thought, is one that directly is reduced to error by the overwhelming dogmatic image of thought that reigns in the realm of the philosophical. But what we have to understand is that when someone says that, like, Kant to Deleuze, and in a sense like Foucault and even Adorno, only ever identifies like illegitimate and legitimate uses of these faculties, but then never questions what underwrites those, right? That's not just a philosophical assertion. When we talk about political subjects, we're talking about who does and does not have sort of claim to a given who does and doesn't have claim to a given political community, right? So when we circumscribe a field, we immediately produce figures who are on the outside. And what you overwhelmingly see in a lot of disability literature is, whether it be narrative prosthesis or parts of Tobin Sieber's work on disability, is you find this archiving of moments of exclusion, like fundamental exclusion, to ensure the sort of maintenance of a unified notion of a subject, right? They have to be able to do this, this, and that, or they have to represent this, this, and that, and this is how they must think, this is how they must act, this is how they must function politically, this is what a political animal is, right? And what the refusal of the image of thought does is that it takes that position from the outside, posits it as the very thing that ensures the functioning of this political system, right? Is that it isn't that. And then it turns that actually into the revolutionary position, the position that can come in and not just overturn like this or that elemental relationship, this or that policy decision, but the very notion of the subject that allowed for all of these other systems of domination to be maintained or to be established. Because once one refuses to be represented by that image of thought, asserts that they don't think that way, that they won't think that way, that they won't represent the broader notion of thinking that way, that they won't operate politically in that same sense, we can start to see that, and this is where we sort of move from Deleuze to Foucault, we can see that not only is like the image of thought functioning as that which establishes a tribunal for everything except for its own presuppositions, but what we see is that the image of thought functions as a sort of medical and juridical norm, in the sense of the work of Gilles or Foucault on abnormality. And what it shows is that there are other forms of life, other modes of being. And when we talk about liberation, when we talk about communism, when we talk about spreading anarchy and living communism, it has to entail the allowing of the free play of different forms of life, the allowing for new modes of being, new assemblages of sensation to come through. Because whether it be capital, bourgeois rule, or institutional power, has a hold on, that at least I think this piece tries to point out, is the conditions of the possibility of what it would mean to think, what it means to experience, and what it means to recognize and utilize those experiences as like a subject. What does it mean to have been through an event?
You know, what part of what I'm thinking of when you're talking to me about this is like, I think I don't know that I transitioned over to Foucault from Deleuze from what you just mentioned here, but like, so the concept of like territory and reterritorialization, right? As it pertains to maybe some Foucauldian notions of stratified power, you know, I get I Jordan Peterson comes to mind, and I'll tell you why. In that, like. Whereas, you know, someone like Foucault or Deleuze would want us to understand, notice, articulate, and then overcome given power structures, given, you know, restraints, given some limitations in society, right? We know not what a body can do, sort of thing. Jordan Peterson, I think, is like kind of just like advocating for a given territory. You stay in your sort of stratified lane, and here's what you can do to like fit in better within that territory, right? So this comes back to your notion in your article of like refusal of the dogmatic image of thought, because there are certain ways that, you know, someone like Jordan Peterson's philosophy is just fundamentally incompatible with some people, particularly maybe the disabled, because for the disabled, there does not exist a dogmatic image of thought that is correlated to their ways of being in the world. Yeah. And so, like, if you took, like, yeah, I don't know, 12 rules for life and you gave it to a disabled person, they'd be like, this is great and all, but, like, this is really ableist and, you know, centric to, like, the functional human body and just not in any way relevant to their experience as a subject in the world, and so I guess, in a way, what your article is getting to is this sort of violent rupture of that dogmatic image of thought that has, now that we have a term for it and a way of articulating the juxtaposition and the tension as a subject that the disabled might feel.
Yeah, I think that's like totally on point when it pertains to like the position of figures like Jordan Peterson, where like there is a strand of liberalism that's like entirely compatible with him. Like I've known a lot of people who consider themselves to be like, you know, they check the right boxes, they donate to the right organizations, they vote down party line who they think is like, but they're entirely compatible with like the slow creeping sort of crypto fascistic elements of Peterson's thought. And part of what I think is frustrating about figures like him is empowerment to Peterson in the limited engagement that I've had with him. Because like I don't think that, like, I know people who are like studying Peterson precisely as a figure who takes a position in relation to contemporary fascism. And I can't imagine like what it must be like to actually be like an archivist working through like Jordan Peterson. But anyway, what's frustrating about figures like Peterson is that for him, liberation is just like learning how to be the right kind of obedient. It is attempting to liberate folks who feel as though they have found themselves outside the bounds of a given social organization, like young men who feel like they don't have social connections that they wish that they did. And in fact, all that Peterson is just trying to do is essentially just pulling them in to the exact system that produced them and spit them out anyway. And rather than what most of them do is take like the fast line of flight to fascism, this malignant flight away, he's attempting to sort of pull them back onto, let's say, the more polite iteration of these systems. And I think that, in a sense, disability is entirely incompatible with all of the assumptions that underwrite what we think is so essential to the human under capital, right? So much of what normalizing power in Foucault comes down to, and apparatuses of capture, is essentially to prevent what Foucault calls worker dissipation in the late 18th and early 19th century. So the concern was no longer about, and we talked about this earlier, about morality, but it was about a laborer ensuring that they could maintain a particular physiological and intellectual position so that they continue to be a productive member of the social body. And there's a vested interest by both the state and bourgeois actors to ensure that these norms are maintained and that there is a process for dealing with abnormality. And that process usually is what enables abnormality is usually what enables, at least in most discourses, for the manifestation of all of these new institutions, right? Like juvenile detention facilities, confinement facilities for the disabled, some of which still function in the United States, right? Like Florida historically still has like some of the worst institutions for disabled citizens, or behavioral correctional facilities, things like that. And all of them end up either trying to reinsert this subject back into a space of not necessarily like moral alteration, but the alteration needs to be so that the subject can adequately recognize its position, its function, their function in that social space, that they are not the king of France, right? They are, a cook at a palace somewhere, on the outskirts of Paris, and that they can return to that position, recognize where they are, who they are, what their debts are. That's important. And so for me, figures like Peterson, he's just trying to get you to do that. He's just trying to recognize where you are on this hierarchy that he's presupposed as essential, and then graft it over capital and say, this is what you need to do in order to either like climb that ladder or function, sufficiently within that sect that I've placed you.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's like Jordan Peterson is like the opposite of your article, basically. It's like, here's how you can, here's the proper way to be obedient so that the system that has cast you out, we can reintegrate you back into that. It's almost like a reverse psychology Foucauldian sort of thing, whereas like the system has made you abnormal, but yet here's how you can take that abnormalness and be just normal enough to where you're not. Yeah, it's wild. So
he's the voice of a very old-fashioned psychiatric power, right?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, like and to me, in a way, it's like I feel like like Jordan Peterson and that admiral that told everyone to make Make Your Beds or whatever.
Yeah.
Like those two characters are very similar to me, and I could see how, and maybe this is a little bit of projection, and I don't mean to like offend any listeners, but if you're like a 25-year-old dude that is in a sort of late capitalist society where your role in the society is abstracted and not clear to you, and so you feel like you're drifting. And I get it, man. Everybody wants that father figure to try to instill discipline in a way, to sort of tell you to make your bed, tell you to get up and go to work and meet your debts and all those things. So for those people that lack a character like that in their life, I could see how someone like Peterson would be compelling. And I do have some people in my life that read that stuff, and if you're like thriving in your life off of Jordan Peterson, I'm not going to try and attack Jordan Peterson that way. It's like, but if you're like, if I could see you're slipping into like sort of the logic of fascism, then I certainly will have that conversation, but I wanted to go back to, and maybe we've covered some of this already, but there's a couple lines in your article that I thought were really wonderful, and I wanted to linger on them for just a moment.
Absolutely.
Like one of them is when you first start out, you say there is a vital, deeply political, aberrant movement called for in difference and repetition that is, in a certain sense, a metaphysical revolutionary gambit. It is the destruction of the dogmatic image of thought, which presupposes its own foundational principles, attempting to apprehend thought outside of this doxa, to move away from the objective and subjective presuppositions and to move outside of the modes of recognition, poses a threat. So, since we've covered a bit of that, but I wonder if you might sort of, for our listeners that aren't especially familiar with difference and repetition or the broader corpus of Deleuze, could you maybe explain what it means by like a metaphysical revolutionary gambit?
Yeah, so like Deleuze is attempting to see if there is a possibility to come up with a philosophical system that is not entirely reliant on the notion of the same and the notion of representation in philosophy. So like those terms should bring, for folks who have some familiarity with the history of metaphysics, those should bring names like Aristotle, other Neoplatonists, Porphyry's tree, for example, right? And Hegel to mind. It's an attempt to think of difference in itself, right? Productive, a productive philosophy of difference that does not rely on a sort of notion of a foundational principle of like recognition. And the risk there is that like modes of representation can be helpful, right? Like especially when we deal with so what would a pure philosophy of difference look like? And I think there are elements of like success and failure in difference and repetition to articulate this, but there's a deep risk essentially because like there's a possibility that this gambit results in falling back onto the old modes, but also and like this endless obliteration of models of representation. There have been attempts to articulate Hegel in different ways. That includes folks like Catherine Malibu, right, who have sort of a really, really, really different reading of Hegel compared to figures like Kojève, right, who's and to a certain sense Hippolyte, although I've not read a lot of his work. But there's a risk, I think, that comes with this movement and destabilization that I think Deleuze takes seriously, but wants to see if there is a possibility of recognizing difference in itself, rather than in relation. And attempting to do that, I think, is relatively risky insofar as it can result in a destruction that yields nothing philosophically. And I think that's why in the essay I sort of try with, I guess, mixed success. I guess I have to give myself like a little like modicum of credit. Like I tend to not think that what I do yields much, but I think I do have an admonition at the end about like what the actual function of the destruction image of the image of thought at the level of the philosophy of disability would mean. It can't just be a dismantling of all of these systems on the grounds of ableism, but there needs to be some sort of new force that is now able to come through, not necessarily constituting new dogmatic images of thought, right? But allowing for not new adjudications of the legitimate, but with the elimination of the adjudication of what is and is not legitimate entirely, allows for all of these new modes of sensation to come through. So when we talk about a metaphysical revolutionary gambit, this was, in a sense, also the anxiety that existed in Adorno's negative dialectics, which I think came out the same year or a year earlier. Someone who knows the history of philosophy better than I do. Like, it's so clear that that Adorno wants to abandon certain elements of the dialectic and move away from certain elements of even in some ways a Neoplatonist thinking and Kantian and Hegelian all at the same time, elements of the dialectic. But there's this anxiety that he really can't achieve it, at least in that first chapter. So when I talk about this movement to bet on the possibility of destroying, frankly, even the destruction of the dogmatic image of thought, like what is left in its wake, right? How do we structure experience? I think that seems to be the real problem insofar as, like, if we destroy the dogmatic image of thought, like, do we actually lose an element crucial to the production of, say, culture and artistic expression and all of these things that allow us to find not only, models for existing in the everyday, like representation helps me get through the street, right? Like the mode of recognition allows me to understand, okay, this means stop, this means go at the very basic level. It also allows me to like understand why particular relationships I have possess meaning, right? And this risk exists all throughout Deleuze, right? Because Deleuze also talks about what destratifying too quickly would mean, right? In I believe AntiOedipus, but also very intentionally in 1,000 Plateaus. So there are these risks. I don't necessarily think that it's a risk that is one that deserves anything other than being pointed out from sort of the get-go. Like, what I tried to do here is, like, what is the expanse of my project? Why do I think that, at least if we're going to try to think of the philosophy of disability outside of the image of thought, what are the risks that we pose there? And I think that pointing them out initially is important, because you are betting on sort of an uncertain future, because you're and that's the beauty of the thing, right? You're not here to constitute a new power to come in and establish what is, categorically legitimate experience. So I think I was just trying to point to that possibility of an anxiety that underwrites the process of destabilization itself.
Right. When you talk about destroying the dogmatic image of thought, I guess what comes to mind was part of like music and art and postmodern music and art, how they tried to ignore or at least refuse some sort of principle organizing rules and fundamental methods to art, right? So like something like atonal music resulted out of
absolutely.
that. And for listeners not familiar with atonal music, it's basically like take 12 notes in an octave and then like it compose a piece of music that doesn't favor any key in any specific note over the other one, right? So you end up with this very peculiar, weird sounding. Some people would even be like, is that music at all? You know, like you're not favoring any note over the other. You're doing away with the concept of keys, keeping you within some sort of Western scale ratio that makes the entire musical piece coherent. So I do get what you're saying in that, like, if we destroy the movement of thought, what kind of thought is possible at that point? And so as much as we are attempting to create new ways of being, new ways of thought, allow new lines of flight, there is ultimately like this gambit or this sort of possibility of like destroying the structure of what even allows thought or modes of recognition to begin with.
Right. And I think too, like even the musical example too is a great one, because like the history of the concept of melody is one that has not always been like one of the things that there was this fantastic moment in a class like a couple months ago where the professor was discussing how like music functioned in ancient Greece and poetics functioned in ancient Greece, but the notion of tonality was entirely different. Like melody became what it meant to say favor the second in a guitar riff is something that might be an important mode of operating when one is trying to produce, say, you know, a particular kind of song, so like a pop rock song. These sorts of rules matter, you know. Even at the we don't even have to go into music theory. We can just say verse, chorus, right? Bridge, chorus.
Yeah.
These things allow for us to have a particular kind of experience, but what we cannot do is allow those things to be treated as presuppositional, but most importantly, primordial to the art, to the mode of art itself. In the same sense that like line work is really important, and no, actually, let's just do color toning and like, what does it mean for a painting to be Baroque, right? Well, it's a mixture of the nature of the subject being painted, also the lighting, and the contrast between, say, the skin and the background, the foreground shading versus the dark background shading, and that's great. But once we begin to start to see the rules that underwrite that production as sort of the fundamentals of art, we start to see sort of takes that, well, Jackson Pollock is not really an artist. Mark Rothko's not really an artist. Mondrian is not really an artist. Is Warhol really an artist?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Is what he producing actually art? Well, what about art that isn't produced by a human being? Is that art? Like, well, yeah, like, sure.
Yeah.
I've never understood people who have to. It's what it is it's an attempt. It's an attempt at delimiting every single conservative tendency when it pertains to thought itself, and bringing it to the point of its own autocritique. Right. One of the lines in this chapter on the image of thought is that Kant multiplies the problems pertaining to the dogmatic image of thought precisely with the introduction of the various categories of experience, because what you don't ever actually get is it being brought, at least to Deleuze, it being brought to the point of autocritique. It's too bad that Deleuze doesn't follow that strain a little bit further. I think it's just one paragraph in that chapter, because he loses me a lot of the time.
Right.
So yeah, I think that your point about music is really important.
I mean, it could be even like I don't know, like now I'm thinking about how I knew this chef that he was a chef at this restaurant that in this town. It was on the corner in this town where I used to live, and you'd go order chili fries from the guy. Chili fries are simple enough. It's like fries, chili, cheese. That's it, right? But he'd hand you this plate that was like Asian fusion over the top of the chili fly. Or chili. So it's like I'm like, and I got to understand after a while. I'm like, this guy's just fucking bored. Actually, this chef is bored, and so when chefs start getting bored, they start doing all sorts of crazy stuff, and you end up ordering chili fries that have like scallions and carrots, and it's like, what? This is not what I asked for, But if you take like a kitchen environment and sort of let's say we killed the dogmatic image of thought of the culinary experience, you would have this sort of train wreck of spices that have no correlation. You would have the abandonment of rules of simple preparation. You would have the uneven slicing of things to create all sorts of erratic shapes, and so it would have maybe it would open up kind of a new combination that has never been tried in such a way that it would benefit us all. But in what way do we all benefit by everyone not knowing that you have to cook chicken all the way through, or that you shouldn't,
I mean,
like shit like that. So
no, like they're in the same way that there can still be good or bad pieces of art. There can still be good or bad plates. The question then becomes like, are there legitimate and illegitimate approaches to thought itself? Like what thought is, if it's left completely beyond reproach, but something that is left to sort of the subjective political experience of the common sense. Well, we all know what it means to think.
Right.
Well, no. And what Deleuze is trying to do, and you get this in his very early work with Instincts and Institutions, is attempting for thought to be perceived as a violence, something that forces us to think. And it is kind of Humean in a sense. Deleuze does sort of reintroduce Hume to an environment that was largely engaging with Husserl, Heidegger, and Hegel. Deleuze will then bring the common like professorial comment, is like, he brought the fourth H, right? It's back into the fold.
Right. Right.
But it is a much more open interpretation of experience, and it is a wondrous creative one, but it fundamentally cannot manifest so long as the dogmatic image of thought, which presupposes the good nature, the goodwill in thinking, that thought aligns itself with the good in the Platonic sense, that once thought is subordinated entirely to like a method, or I guess not a method, like a particular structure, then what we find is discussions about the morality of particular approaches to simply existing, that not only are like particular modes of being reduced to error, but that error is precisely a moral failure. And I think that is a position that puts that other mode of thinking, or that other image of thought, most importantly, in the position of opposition. And it's immediately now a conflict between forms of life.
Well, I think maybe this is a good spot to hit this next question, as it seems kind of pertinent here. But like, in sticking with your opening sentence, there's a vital, deeply political, aberrant movement called for indifference and repetition. You go on to say later on that this aberrant movement is one that destabilizes the dogmatic image of thought and leaves in its wake in the encounter the violence from the outside that forces thought. So I'm wondering, within your reading of Difference and Repetition, Do you think that Deleuze is actually calling for like an aberrant movement? Could you maybe frame this as like a semiotic insurrection?
I think in a certain sense it could be seen as to call out our friends over at Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour, a revolutionary
Right.
semiotics.
Right.
Yeah, like it's possible. Like it's possible that will. I mean, certainly, like when we talk about the function of semiotics, and especially if we're going to like talk about the role of Lacan and this structuring of the mind and the structuring of the unconscious. I think that we could definitely read it as something that allows for a sort of semiotic insurrection. But I also think that this destabilization of the dogmatic image of thought is something that allows for an insurrection that recognizes that the stakes are at the level of the subject, that it is not just these competing molar, both like identified and legitimized institutions and molar collectivities that have been recognized by those institutions, right? So whether it be workers and owners of the means of production, but what other things also allow and contribute to that relationship, that dynamic. So when we talk about destabilizing the image of thought, I think it also opens up for a possibility of, I'm going to steal a line from Adam on Acid Horizon, seizing the means of subjectivation, a recognition of the fact that there are processes that function in order to produce particular subjectivities, particular modes of being. And I think once one begins to at least recognize those processes and those functions, there can then be a sort of broader open understanding of revolt. I think one group that does sort of a good job in articulating the function of subjectivity in questions of when we talk about like metaphysical revolt, like overturning of these things. One group that does a good job of talking about the position of the subject in contemporary thought is actually going to be these more political groups like Tikkun, who's like overwhelmingly metaphysical. And when they talk about apparatuses of capture and the way in which they deal with the process of the subject, they're dealing heavily with like Heideggerian ontology. The theory of Bloom is a theory of presences. So when we talk about whether an image of thought or a philosophical project can have broader political implications, I think one has to look no further than these other far more provocative groups who actually do have a relatively significant political ontology that underwrites their ability to produce the provocative assertions that they do.
So there's one or two more questions here, but some of the most profound statements you've made in this article, or at least two that stuck out for me, and I've taken these two from the same paragraph, because as much as I'd like to turn things over to you and have you share as much as you're comfortable with, maybe you could expound upon what you meant by this when you say the disabled body becomes a literary war machine that refuses the philosophical language of the unified liberal subject and becomes a mechanism which we can come to understand how philosophy itself functions as a dispositif and thwarts the formation of new worlds and new forms of life on the grounds of a metaphysical and epistemological incongruity and incorrigibility. The disabled body manifests as both the target and refutation of a dogmatic image of thought that acts as a method of philosophical immunization.
So essentially, what I'm trying to get at, I think, like it's always hard to talk about, oh well, what was the author, who is me trying to get at here, and it's always hard to expound upon yourself, but I'll try to give an account of my own writing in that way. When we talk about philosophy as a dispositif, or the common translation is apparatus, but it's like largely it's a largely contested term in Foucault's work. So the translation is apparatus. There are plenty of folks who don't think that that's a good translation. So I try to use both here to allow you to sort of start to understand that, like, this concept of the apparatus sort of breaks down in Foucault a little bit if you just translate it as apparatus. But so I just wanted to do that so that Foucaultians don't get too mad at me, because they sometimes are very nitpicky. And philosophy functioning as a dispositif, which is an apparatus, is that which suspends a subject and directs it toward what can be considered a norm. So Foucault, in his work, at least to my understanding, sees a relationship between, to bring it back to Hume, but in a very different way, in a more polemical way, sees the notion of the Humean habit as playing a role in allowing for normalizing power to manifest. But he never actually argues that philosophy itself is an apparatus. That's actually Giorgio Agamben in his work on Foucault, where he argues that different philosophical frameworks provide forces that direct subjects to act and operate and function a specific way. And this is modernist philosophy we're talking about. Of course, Foucault, when he returns to antiquity, is going to see all of these different processes of becoming an ethical subject to be really important to power and to the processes that underwrite the formation of apparatuses. But so when I talk about, or when I try to talk about how the disabled body rejects the philosophical language of a unified liberal subject, it's necessary to understand that with liberal politics, there has to be an understanding of several key things, only two of which I can really touch on without having to spend like 10 years talking about it. One would be like the reasonable political subject, right? Who can exercise reason and participation. But of course, no one actually understands what, like, let's say, reasonable participation would mean, right? Reasonable expectation. The other would be governing consent, right? Perpetual governing consent. What does it mean for a subject to consent to be governed? And then also participation in the social. What does it mean to even recognize the social? What does it mean to be in the social? What does it mean to be conscripted to the social contract? To just bring it to the most basic POL 101, Rousseau treatment of this. So the disabled body, I think, is that which both exists outside of this circumscription of legitimate political subjects because they express, orient, and operate in a very particular way, but also at the same time, it's the very thing that allows for that to function, that must always be prevented. Unreason, illness, incapacity. That is the very reason why all of these things exist, or at least that's the justification that they provide, right? Were you not under, the American Republic, think of all of the things you couldn't do. Think of the mobility you wouldn't have. Think about the danger and the ill health you would possess. And the prevention of indolence, of unreason, what we classify as all of these things that are threatening to the functionality of these social bodies, are in fact things that often manifest or are ascribed to the disabled body with a value judgment, right? So what the disabled body then becomes is a mirror of the insufficiency of that understanding of the political subject.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about, let's say, attempts historically to pull we were just having a conversation about Peterson trying to pull particular rejected men back into society. If we think about all of these goodwill attempts to try to allow for an extension of what a subject under capitalism is, or to allow for a particular kind of participation in the market, in the job market for disabled bodies, so like the ADA, right? It allows for it only insofar as it operates exclusively as an extension, right? It allows for it insofar as it sees this set of bodies as fundamentally foreign to the centralized norm that the society functions on, and it says, well, here's how we can allow them to participate in this qualified way. Now, I think in the face of COVID, we have a better understanding of just how the medical and juridical processes intertwine, what access to healthcare, for example, means when we talk about medical rationing, or let's say the governor of New York sending, I think it was something like 9,000 COVID positive patients back into an institution, back into institutions in New York, knowing that there would be this outcome. But it's precisely because these individuals are already existing on what we consider the margins of the social body, already participating in what we would call the Great Confinement. And for that reason, we can sort of immunize ourselves from that population. And it's philosophy, I think, in a sense, that often operates as the mechanism that justifies it. Well, a subject is one that recognizes their own existence in a very particular way, or that can distinguish between themselves and the rest of the social body, or and the list goes on and on and on. So I think that we often sometimes don't see what it means to define thought and behavior and action as sort of a particular presupposed norm, or something that everyone ought to understand or is commonsensical, that can then allow for what we see as very immediate and very material tragedies. And they're not, to say tragedy is to also like underwrite, right? Oh, just COVID was just a thing that happened, right? This stuff no, like there are actors in government that are allowed to make these decisions, and the reason they don't hit the same way that they otherwise would is because these folks are already immunized from the population at just the level of how we recognize them as subjects, let alone how we understand them as individuals suffering in an immediate crisis.
Yeah, wow. When you put it that way, it's really incredible that like, and I mean, I think at some level we understand that like, you know, we understand that we have subjects outside of the confines of the social places and institutions that are in the exterior in such a way that we're not confronted with them on a day-to-day basis. And so they're suffering, much like in the way that Americans are very divorced from, say, the suffering of people in India to COVID right now or something, you know. The detachment lies in the way that we occupy the interior, while there is this exterior ground that is on a certain level. I mean, certainly on the level of the subject, they are to a certain degree sort of dehumanized in that they're not seen as fully rational subjects, you know, and they're not seen as something that is pertinent to the core operation of the social as a whole. So thinking about that stuff that way, that's really incredible. I've got one more question for you, and I would love if you could linger on a few words about how you can intervene in the process of subjectification.
I think that process is one that comes down to a kind of consciousness raising in the sort of Lukácsian sense, but an intervention in or a recognition of the processes of subjectivation is, I don't think, a kind of, there's not a threshold that exists in the way that some thinkers post-Marx talk about class consciousness, right? It has to be a perpetual recognition that also necessitates a perpetual failure, right? Because in the same sense that like Deleuze talks about in his book on Foucault, just how the structuring of the letters on a keyboard, right, allow for the discursive formation and the manifestation of particular modes of communication to manifest, and what that means. So like it is to recognize, I think, that one has a perpetual role in the games of power, and to begin to look for immediate struggles that exist to them in ways that might seem like unimportant or not representative of a broader problem, right? So like there are often all of these discussions about how like, well, don't purchase this thing because it won't change, or don't not purchase this thing because there's nothing you can do. You can't alter. They'll take the Adorno quote about there's no ethical consumption under capitalism anyway. There's nothing you can do, right? So to put it in a Marxist lens, that's one thing you can do. But the other is to just simply to try to find ways to reject these games of power. It's to take a sort of necessary abolitionist position when it comes to the differentiation of, well, not the differentiation, the moralization of the differentiation of bodies, not to engage in that discourse in a way that says, no, actually what we can do is we can extend it. We can say, well, also these people too. It's to reject the entirety of that process, to understand the conditions that allowed for that discussion to be had. So I think that the opposition of the present is one that has to always come down to refusing its conditions, to understand that its conditions are not necessarily the result of a sort of progressive and necessary development of events, but in fact, a series of really, really delicate contingencies that at any point in time can be exposed as relatively fragile. So if historical events have that same fragility, I think you too, as a subject, have that same instability. So I think it's attempting to, and rarely succeeding, to adequately recognize those contingencies.
Will is a co-host on the Acid Horizon podcast. You can find him wherever you find podcasts by looking up Acid Horizon. His website is revoltingbodies.com. His article is called Thought, Disability, and Refusal. And you can find him on Twitter. His handle is @EmoFoucault. Will, do you have any parting words before we
No, just that I really
here?
enjoyed the episode with Matt Lowry, who's one of our co-hosts on Carl Schmitt. I thought that episode was fantastic, and I'm really enjoying the people that you're connecting with. I'm also enjoying the fact that you're starting to sort of expand outward from the immediately theoretically political also to like music and things like that, because I think all of those things are necessarily connected. So I think I'm excited to see where this project takes you. I think it's been a really interesting one so far. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
Cool.
It really means
it was a lovely conversation. I loved your article, and it got me thinking about Deleuze in a couple different ways now. And I was trying to go through the rounds of all the co-hosts on Acid Horizons. I had done, Matt, and then I was like, oh, well, let's get Craig on the show. And then I'm like, well, there's only like a couple more of these dudes.
Yeah, we got to do is we got to have you on to talk about a.
Yeah. I got to meet with a whole squad and hang out. Yeah. But yeah, so I typically like, I look for articles that, like, we've done one with like Roderick Day about his redsales.org stuff, and but I look for articles that really kind of shake up my ways of thinking, and so I was really pleasantly surprised, because obviously, like, I can look the internet and find all sorts of articles and then find someone, but in knowing I had like targets, I'm like, okay, so what does Will do, and I was just, like, it was a great article. It was delightful. It was lovely.
I appreciate
it.
Dude,
this is wonderful. And I had such a good time talking to you, and let's do this again sometime, man. And, more about Foucault in the future.
Absolutely.
Or whatever, but it's certainly something else. So cool. Yeah. Awesome. All right. I'm going to hit stop on the recording thing here.